All right, everybody, welcome to our lecture on 1980s fashion. Today we're going to talk about lifestyles and typical accessories and clothes for the 1980s, but first, let's listen to this little gem, shall we? Are you getting into it? Getting into the 80s vibe a little bit? That's Take On Me from Aha, One Hit Wonder? No? Not even a... No? Not... No? Okay. Well, can't say I didn't try, right? Okay. All right, I guess it's time to get serious. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about 80s fashion. And I put in the title slide fragmentation of fashion because that is indeed what we're looking at with the different style types that came from the 70s and that will translate into the 90s. So let's get right into it. It's the decade of excess. A lot of excess. Bigger, more, on many different arenas. Now let's look at what's happening in the backdrop so you understand how it translated into fashion. So one is greed and money. So the excess when it comes to climbing that corporate ladder was really important. So people were really big on making money, and that seemed to be an emphasis. Make more money, high paying job, make more money. This obsession with like showing off brands, showing off how much money you spend on clothes and accessories, that just became such a prominent theme. Another thing that we looked is that fashion kind of revolted against the 60s and 80s. So it kind of was like, no, we're going to take some of the simplicity of the simplistic lines of the 60s and 70s, and we're going to go all out. So it was a backlash to that. We did have a lot of more women entering the workforce and going into like corporate jobs. There was a big theme of dress for success. So a lot of blazers, a lot of power suits for both men and women. We coined terms like yuppies, so young people that were trying to climb that corporate ladder faster than that was typical. So before it was like you pay your dues, right? You go into a company, you work for 20 years and you work your way up. No, it was like I'm young, I'm new, right out of college, and I'm going to work my way up like instantly. Very ambitious, again looking for a lot of money. A lot of overspending. I cannot stress to you the overspending and overborrowing. It started actually in the 70s, but it really culminated in the 80s. A lot of this was in the retail sector, like for businesses as well as for private individuals. And in the business sector, this is what affected, I mean, we still feel the effects of it today. That's why we have some problems with manufacturers and retailers. And that's how you had junk bonds and leverage buyouts, the LBOs. We saw a lot of bankruptcies or near bankruptcy, so a lot of companies merged together. And another thing that we noticed was that the lines of credit were extended to people. Not everyone had it. Now anyone can have a credit card, but before it wasn't like that. We started extending credit. Everyone had a credit card, and everyone started charging and charging and charging. So debt got racked up. Personal debt was really high. This caused a lot of strain in the family. So divorce rates were really high in the 80s. In fact, it spiked. So that was something happening. Globalization. So now we start seeing companies get bigger because they're merging together. We start seeing more uses of imports. We start seeing more companies expand globally. And this is where we start seeing the expansion of the supply and demand chain. And I gave you a little link so you can take a look at it. It gives you kind of a little summary of what the 80s look like. More on the backdrop. So Cold War ends, the European expands, and it really pushes kind of this, and as technology develops, this kind of globalism. So we're all interrelated, interlinked, going more global. So more imports, looking at getting things done overseas. And this is where we started losing a lot of manufacturing and going a lot overseas. We started seeing changing the American family because that spike in divorce rates. And we started seeing these style tribes, and some formed right at the end of the 80s and went on to the 90s. But the ones that predominated in the 80s, goth, preppy, and fashion fetish. So those were like the big ones for the 80s. And you had the development of hip hop, grunge, which is really what the 90s are known for, emo, which also is like 2000s, 90s and 2000s is known for. It actually started in the late 80s and expanded on. Let's get to what you want to get to, which is the fashion, right? That's what you're interested in. All right, let's get to it. So, early 80s. It is just like before, similar to the end of the decade. Like I've told you a million times before, it's not like, okay, January 1st, 1980, we're switching how we dress. No, it doesn't work that way. So early 80s looks very similar to the late 70s. Where we really started seeing a stylistic change really integrate. We're looking at about 1983. So 1980, 81, and 82, really similar to the 70s. Not a whole lot of difference. So this picture was taken in the early 80s, but it could have been taken in the 70s, and we could have, could easily believed it. We still had party goers from Studio 54 in 1980. So this was right for, right, 1980. We did have a development of New Romantics. So this group where they did like kind of that boho chic and long flowy lines that they liked from the 70s. They wanted to keep that going for the 80s. So we did have a development of a group like that, a style tribe that liked those kind of flowy looks. But the fact is, the 80s, they're symbolized by a look that was counteractive to the 70s, at least in some ways. Not in all, but in some ways. So key looks in the 80s, it's basically bold style. Bold is a bold and big, the double B's, bold and big. So big on style, so on volume, colors, silhouette, perm hair included. I mean perms. I mean big hair, big shoulder pads, big skirts, big, big, big. The bigger, the better. And we had a range of trends. So it wasn't like just one particular trend or three particular trends. It had a range. Anything from ripped tights and leather to polished, oversized blazers, like the big oversized, men's blazers that women would wear. We had so many style icons, anything that ranged from Joan Jett to Joan Collins. It really was, in terms of a decade or a particular era of style, I definitely would say very eclectic. That means such a variety, such a lot of mixture. It wasn't just like one or two key looks. So shoulder pads, power suits, and everything that's in between. That's what I put on there. It's just because there's so much there. So big hair. Hair was big. I always joke that the big thing was Aquanet, which if you haven't seen it, it's like a blowtorch in a can. It's essentially hairspray that's almost all entirely made out of alcohol. And if you put it by a lighter, it becomes a blowtorch. And people would douse their hair. If you look at 80s movies or movies that make fun of the 80s, you see someone just spraying so much hairspray because that's what they did. That's the joke. We were like, oh, that's funny. No, that really did happen. I grew up in the 80s. I know. They bust out that Aquanet and and it's stiff. You would touch that and it would be crunchy. Do you notice how when you look at hair products, it'll say it'll give you this without the crunch? Because that's what we all remember, the crunch, because that's what your hair would be. Perms, wave, frizzy. That frizzy permed hair was really big. So perms, everyone was perm. I got a perm in the 80s. I admit I did. Or I think early 90s. I can't remember. I did get a perm in junior high though. Spandex. So this is, Lycra changed the world, and the 80s just went all for it. Late 70s because of that workout wear. And it just became so popular, and it just Lycra everywhere. And we never looked back with that. Like Spanx, that's their whole, became a game changer when you had Lycra. Ripped knees. So ripping your pants in the knees were so in, and I love that relationship between parents and grandparents and the kids, because they would get pants that were ripped, brand new, off the rack, and it would cost more because they were ripped. And the parents would be like, why do you want you want pants with rips? You can go to your closet. You have those old pair of pants. They're ripped already. Why do you want to spend all this money on this? And the kid would be like, but this is the in thing. Those are old and I don't want those. I want these. These are ripped the right way. And I just know parents were just they couldn't get it. It's what's going on here? Lacy shirts, a lot of playing with sheer and lacy shirts. Leg warmers were really big. Leggings. High-waisted jeans, you're going to look at them and think really high-waisted compared to the low-rise that we have today. Neon, oh my gosh, neon. The neon colors were insane. People loved it. Mullets, which is the haircut where you had shorter in the front and longer in the back. The joke is we say it's all business in the front and a party in the back. But as much as we make fun of it, like Tiger King with the mullet, that was popular in the 80s. We joke, we laugh, we look at it and we kind of make fun and we laugh, but that was what was popular. Retro styles from the past, they did look back at the 70s a little bit, although it was a backlash of the 70s and 60s, but they did look a little bit in the 50s a little bit, and a couple of past decades to get some inspiration. Musicians became really popular. So before, remember, it's like Hollywood actors and actresses have always been trendsetters, but we really started looking at musicians and certain figures like Princess Diana was like huge for the 80s, really like a fashion icon. So people really looked at that. So they really looked to musicians and things like layering, the light colored sandblasted jeans, the puffy vest that comes in on trend for us every so often. Started in the 80s. The preppy look, where you had people look, like they're ready for the country club and, trying to climb up that casual corporate ladder. That became popular. Retro styles again, past fashion. So you had hip hop, the hip hop look, which you think 90s, but it really did start in the 80s, and bold colors with contrast piping and contrast bands of stripes of color, having the wide cut legs with the zippered in several openings, and that came about with lots of little details on the lower pant leg. But the track jackets were popular. The military look, as you see every decade, it comes back. You saw it in all the previous decades and came back in the 80s. We just had kind of a revival and we saw camo and all these interesting colors, so it comes back. So military made its way in the 80s as well. Combat boots were really big. The Doc Martens were huge for that, although they came really into play in the 90s. But still, they started in the 80s. The camouflage, obviously the pants, became popular at this time frame. Also, casual dress was more of an accepted way of dressing for the office. So it's interesting. We had the power dressing, right? So we had this. Think about what I said previously. Power dressing, power suits, right? That statement: dress for the job you want, not the job you have. And the idea is looking forward to wanting to get that higher corporate job. Really making it in the corporate setting was popular back then. So what's interesting is that you have, and especially younger people trying to really dress up to look like they're executives so they can get the executive job. But then you also had this movement, like I've mentioned before, in particular menswear, everything's going more casual. And that's where we start developing, a more casual feel, even for the office. So like this picture, see before, remember, we're in the 80s. We're not 2020. This is the 80s. What you understand is before, if you'd see this, you'd look at this and go, oh my gosh, wow. Like if this man dressed like this, 5 years prior, no jacket in the office, and this doesn't really go, and there's no jacket, not a full suit, it would be like, oh, what are you doing? Why are you dressed like that? You're in the office. You can't dress like that. That would not be accepted. If you're a businessman, you would have your suit. You would wear your suit. That was big in the 60s. And for those that were in the business sector in the 70s, still important. Now remember, I told you suits started getting more and more casual in the 70s, right? And this is where it culminates in the 80s, where you do have this more casual approach to even your workwear. Okay, so I hope you see this transition that kind of started back a while back. All right, so this concludes our part 1 of 80s fashion. We'll finish up with part 2.